Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're talking to Kuba, whose last name is invariably Polish, but you can see it spelled out, which I think comes up on every podcast you're ever on. Actually, is how no one can actually say your last name.
Every podcast, every event, every first day of school.
Yeah, so it's probably old to you by this point. And he will be a familiar face because he was just on a kind of emergency panel we did on Palestine. And he may have black-pilled even me. But today we're going to talk about leftist misunderstanding of the security apparatus, how the U.S. actually goes about its business, what its major geopolitical concerns may or may not be. And without saying anything that would cost you a security clearance or a job, how do you know this, Kuba?
Okay, excellent. I was going to suggest that we start with a little bit of my background, so your viewers can see where I'm coming from. I've been a socialist since I was a teenager. I grew up in a Polish immigrant family in Canada, in interior British Columbia. And I was accepted to Harvard very unexpectedly. Everyone had told me I was smart. And so when it came time for college applications, I'm like, what are the places that I've heard of in movies and books? Like, what's the fanciest handbag? What's the most exclusive university? And to my surprise, I was accepted. And when I went, my kind of adolescent socialism was confirmed by coming into contact with the once and future elite. When it comes to my leftist politics, it's not so much that I love working people. Working people are people. Some of them are great. Some of them are wonderful. Some of them are generous. Some of them are kind. Some of them are terrible. Some of them are absolutely toxic. So there's no real distinction there. But having met the individuals who would go on to be peak leaders in finance, in government, in the legal profession, people who go on to have political ambitions, and one of my former roommates has a reasonable chance of becoming the first Muslim American Supreme Court justice. And let me tell you, none of those people need to be in charge. Having sort of internalized or experienced the acculturation, the indoctrination, if you will, of high achieving, ultra ambitious Americans, people from all over the world. Even many of the foreigners end up staying in the United States and entering kind of American elite circles. It made me very suspicious of the leadership class as a whole. And I went there at a time when the kind of 1990s neoliberal politics were absolutely hegemonic. Washington consensus forever. The war on terror had just begun. I was a junior on September 11th, and it was a pretty hopeless period for leftists because there was still the post-socialist, post-USSR extinction going on, kind of assumption that geopolitical moment had discredited leftist politics for all time, and that the internet and the market were going, and globalization were just going to go on forever, and you had to get with the program. I went on to intern at the Atlantic Council. They sent me to Warsaw, where I worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. I went to graduate school at Berkeley, specializing in political science. I got my PhD. I met Anders Fogh Rasmussen when he was still Prime Minister of Denmark, but he had been tapped for NATO leadership. I was allowed to ask him one question. He evaded my question, so I pushed with an unauthorized follow-up and visibly pissed him off, but which remains one of my proudest moments. When I was in graduate school, through Harvard cronyism, I had the opportunity to join a Department of Defense project in the Middle East, working on tribal engagement, stabilization, reconstruction in Iraq. The Comintern wasn't hiring, so I figured that I would get on with it and try to find a fit for myself in the establishment world. It was an interesting experience. I worked with flag officers, generals, people from largely the Department of Defense, but different branches, Army, Air Force, Marine Corps. I also worked with shady civilian contractors that were current or former intelligence agents. And then I, after a few years, I spent a few years working on that. Then I took a break to finish my PhD. I returned to Washington because a friend of mine from Berkeley had moved there and become a kind of big deal in the think tank world. And she said she'd help me find a place there. She did not. But I ended up working with my old Iraq people in defense contracting. I worked on a number of projects, and I stayed on the relatively innocuous end. No torture, no intelligence gathering, no what we could say kinetic operations. But I did things like that's the term of art. But I did geopolitical and economic risk assessments and studies for the Air Force, as well as doing a stem to stern, if you pardon the mixed metaphor, review of the U.S. Air Force pilot ecosystem. Everything from recruiting, junior ROTC, civilian outreach, licensing, quality of service, quality of life during pilots' career, as well as separation, retirement, retention around the separation point. I got to make several briefings to flag officers. They called me doctor, which melted my heart. And in fact, the picture of Biden with two Air Force female generals, I'd worked with both of them. I'd presented to both General Van Obost and I can't remember the other one's name, but they were great to work with. They were very engaged, very committed. And I saw both the business and the programmatic side of defense work, how to get contracts, how contracts are issued, what gets contracted out, how to win contracts, as well as how the work actually gets done. I started the contracting company that I was working with. started to reach for more Department of Homeland Security type Customs and Border Patrol work, and began encroaching in areas that I didn't find comfortable, particularly being an immigrant. And I was told on a Tuesday that my last day would be a Friday, which coincided with the end of my visa. So they gave me 10 days to leave the country. When I told them, like, you know, that you're basically expelling me from the United States, they're like, oh, we'll give you an extra day so you can have a grace period. But at that point, my the disenchantment had gotten deep enough, so I moved back to Canada. I'm sponsoring my girlfriend for residency here. It's really great, and I have a small sort of one-man consulting shop where I work with the Department of Labor, civilian agencies, and foreign governments, largely on economic assessment, sort of bureaucratic transformation, these kinds of things. So that's where I get my insight from. There are people who, when I mentioned to some of my friends from my Washington days, that on some leftist outlets, I thought it was like the deep state plant, right? They found it absurd, but then when they thought about it, they're like, I guess you qualify because you have the experience. You know, you have been to the Pentagon. You know, you always needed a visitor pass because as a Canadian, I could never get a security clearance.
Yeah.
Especially as a Canadian with an interesting life, you can just forget it. And but in that world, I was always very much on the margins. That said, I have my experience with it is real. I know what the personalities and procedures are like. I've done the work. So that's, I think of it as like an extended field research. You know, what does the military industrial complex look like from the inside? You know, years and years of it. But it's a heterogeneous, and one of the things that you learn is that the evil genius theory of the CIA or of the Defense Department, that does not survive first contact.
No.
You meet the people who are responsible for carrying it out, and there are some impressive individual figures, but they operate in a bureaucratic structure like any. And the pressures that they face and the priorities that they establish for themselves have a lot more to do with their personal promotion, their job security, the task immediately ahead of them, rather than any large strategic vision for how to do international politics or how to pull the strings of the world. And these agencies are so large that there's different centers. The Department of Defense has a different set of priorities and a different outlook than the think tank community, for instance, or the intelligence community. And while there are kind of hyper-empowered dark nodes that I only saw the edges of in the intelligence agencies, where you have a great deal of freedom and a great deal of resources, very little oversight, those sectors are still small and weird, and they do not move the overall. It's more like they're little carve outs within an overall bureaucratic system. Then that's the secret nerve center that's running the whole thing. The idea of a rogue agent, that's perfectly justified. It's perfectly plausible, right? There are in the special forces, for instance, there are mid-level officers, right? Like at the command level, but not at the general strategic level, that have enough freedom of operation so that they could be doing something completely sketchy on their own. But and they might have a plan they're carrying out, but we're talking about relatively small scale units that are as effective as the personalities involved. The bigger picture stuff, it grinds through bureaucratic processes, a lot of which are visible to the public if they just want to pay attention. I've been to so many events where they don't really leak classified information, but they'll tell you so much that you can
figure it
in
out.
a lot of the blanks yourself. And it's designed to be public education. Journalists arrive, people from think tanks arrive. It's not that there's a whole secret government with a secret agenda. They'll tell you what the agenda is, and in fact, they'll give you 5 different conflicting agendas, none of which make sense. And the end result of those politics, the end policy that the world has to endure, is the compromise and the result of the clash between all of these things, as well as the bureaucratic priorities, political cycles, and the kind of trends that go through the think tank community. A great deal of the high-level strategic thinking behind U.S. policy is just outsourced whole cloth to the think tanks around Washington, D.C. There's, generally speaking, a liberal consensus and a conservative consensus, as well as all kinds of outliers. And the depending on who wins elections and kind of the individual level personality politics, you get a policy based on who wins elections and who's chosen to when a new administration steps up.
Yeah, my experience with that world is nowhere near as direct as yours. I taught the children of people like you for years at international baccalaureate schools, and actually even more so the children of the locals that the U.S. military would interface with. Although I did realize that the upper strata of government servants of the state and the bourgeoisie were a lot less competent than I thought. Even if they were competent as individuals, actually, to paint them all as idiots is not correct. It's more that there's a lot more of a klug going on than what anyone realizes. But the other thing, a klug is a concept from engineering where you have created this accidentally over complex machine.
Yes.
I mean,
say no more. That accidentally over complex is a very elegant summation.
So, that's my experience of it from the person who's just tangentially involved. I've been weirdly tangentially involved a couple of times in my life. One of the scholarships I was offered as a coming out of high school was tied to West Point, but also had a weird CIA sponsorship behind it, so I turned it down.
Of course it did.
And so I've kind of felt like I've seen the outskirts of this for a while, and when I hear leftists talk about it, they don't seem to be talking about the same world that I saw. But due to a variety of factors, public disinterest, the fact that we don't have a draft anymore, the fact that so much of this is privatized now, a lot of people just aren't ever exposed to this world. And when you compound that with the fact that most Americans don't travel outside of the United States and don't really seem to totally view these countries as fully articulated agents with their own clashes and internal interests, that it's rife for this misunderstanding, I think.
Well, it's also, to give credit where credit's due, the military and the CIA both spend a great deal of energy attempting to influence the culture so that that perception exists. One of the events that I went to when I was working with the U.S. Air Force pilots was a photo shoot at Edwards Air Force Base in California, where there was a large gathering of female Air Force pilots. It was kind of an affinity group event, and they did a Captain Marvel shoot at the same time, promote the movie because she's an Air Force pilot, and they turned that into an entire recruitment campaign as well as a means of pushing the feminist bona fides of the Department of Defense and especially the Air Force. And there's a very strong popular culture tradition of CIA heroes, masterminds, smartest people in the room, and a kind of heroism of competence around the military, as well as the simplification of international politics to good guys and bad guys. And of course, the United States is always the good guy, and the bad guys are the ones who disagree with anything that the United States wants to do. And that's they had the Jack Ryan series on Amazon, and that was another example of this promotion of the idea of hyper competence on the part of American intelligence agencies, which is completely out of it's inflated. It's heavily inflated. These organizations are not that functional. And one reason why the United States and its military apparatus, security apparatus, has had such a disproportionate impact on the world is because after the demise of the USSR, there was no center of power with the resources and the operations to push back against the US. But rather than ordering the world along American lines, which is kind of what some presidents thought they were doing, you had this kind of blundering forward.
I think about and the blundering forward, like the way NATO handled the Russian Federation's establishment in the 90s seems particularly short-sighted. I'll use that nice word in hindsight, as far as also maintaining a Russian sphere of influence outside of Western influence, at making any Atlanticist forays in Russian politics, even of a united Russia variety like Medvedev. Sure I said that name right. Medvedev, back when he was Putin's chosen successor, he was actually part of the Atlanticist faction over there, and we have strategically botched that in a way that seems to make a lot of the elements the U.S. is most concerned about in Eastern Europe more powerful, not less, and legitimately so within their sphere of influence. So
I think that one, my dad would tell this joke about Brezhnev and Jimmy Carter meeting in Helsinki, and ahead of the summit, there's this conference, and the Brezhnev says, we stand against imperialism. We're in favor of decolonization and oppressed peoples everywhere. South Africa, anti-apartheid, decolonization, end of exploitation, workers' paradise. And then Carter comes in, and he's like, human rights in Eastern Europe, human rights everywhere, democracy, freedom. And then the journalists all go. It's just the Soviet delegation and the American delegation. They sit down, and Brezhnev, the Soviets open it up, and it's like, okay, what do you want? Jimmy Carter says, the important thing is we need to secure human rights in Eastern Europe. And Brezhnev is like, okay, but really, are we talking missiles? Are we talking Afghanistan? Or spheres of influence? What's the deal here? This is your meeting. No, what I really want to talk about is human rights in Eastern Europe. And Brezhnev is like, look, the journalists are gone, so we can get down to business. Like, is this about our nuclear program? Is this about oil? I don't, you got to give me something here, like, just let me know so we can talk, hash it out like real people, like grown-ups. It's like, no, human rights in Eastern Europe, we got to look after the poor Afghans, we have to, and then it dawns on the Soviets, it's like, oh my God, these people believe their own propaganda. Like, how can you deal with them if they're so auto brainwashed that they do not have a realist worldview, that you can't actually get down to business with them? They confuse the distraction game, right, with the actual work of geopolitics. Then what are you going to do? Like, we'll do human rights in Eastern Europe. Oh, great. So there is a great deal of cognitive dissonance in Washington, D.C., where on the one hand, you lose your job if you don't look after the hard interests. If you don't, if you sort of get in the way of American IP controls internationally, for instance, or if you complicate the relationship with Israel, for moral grounds, or if you try to torpedo the F-35 fighter or NATO expansion, something that's a political priority that has muscle behind it, you'll lose your career. That's it. You're done. But you don't think of yourself as being the shepherd of the F-35 program, or the functionary that's making sure Israel has the resources that it needs, or the agent of transatlanticist NATO expansion. You think that you're defending freedom. You tell yourself, this is about liberty, this is about protecting America, that there's real risks, there's boogeymen out there, and you're keeping children in the Midwest safe. And if you don't believe that, then you tend to wash out. There's a small number of people who don't believe that and are stone cold psychopaths, and they do very well. But that's a tiny, tiny number, and they have to expend a great deal of their energy corralling the people who do drink the Kool-Aid and do need to believe that this is about freedom and democracy and all that good stuff. It's not, to quote the great philosopher George Costanza, it's not a lie if you believe it. Mm-hmm. And that is the way that the United States squares the circle, or rather the cadres of the United States square the circle, where they do what is necessary, but believe what lets them sleep at night. There's no room for black bills in Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C., it's always 1996. It's 1996 with complications. But there's this assumption that the world is craving American leadership, that the United States is still defining the global good, that we've hit a bit of a speed bump on this whole globalization, markets, and democracy thing. But that's really the only way forward. That's the only hope. So that's the plan, and we're sticking to it. It makes it very challenging for the United States to address geopolitical issues seriously and maturely. And it makes the United States a terrible partner for Iran, a terrible partner for Russia, a terrible partner for any country which has been kind of branded as a malefactor. Because even if you find a leader like Obama who's willing to talk to Iran, that won't necessarily survive his administration. And the tendency to default back to like the 1996 realities, right? The very comforting America as agent of progress mythos, mm-hmm. Creates opposition from people who just can't think that flexibly, right? Like, if you've been told your entire career that Iran is a Shia death cult bent on eradicating Jews from the planet, and then now you have to make nice with them, There's in Obama's memoirs, he talks about the blob, this kind of amorphous foreign policy set that can't be tied to any particular office, that can't be tied to any particular personality. But when you try to change policy, there's this resistance. It's almost like an atmospheric resistance. It's almost like there's a viscosity in the air. Everything moves more slowly. All of these technical issues come up, which don't come up if you're going in the other direction. And that is the kind of collective mentality of all of these cadres asserting itself. You can't be directly oppositional because then you're in conflict with your bosses. But when there's an alignment around conventional sort of bipartisan conclusions or worldviews, then you can safely slow move things even if you're ordered to do them. Because the person who would fire you is also agrees with you, right? And it's funny because for Obama, this was a great criticism. When it happened under Donald Trump, things like General Mattis famously saying, "No, we're not going to bomb Syria as soon as Trump leaves the room." And that's the blob as well. It's the same mechanism. But it's treated heroically in that case because Trump is seen as a dangerous and destabilizing force. It's difficult, and all of this shows the limits of presidential decision making on foreign policy. On the one hand, presidents have a great deal of autonomy, much more autonomy on foreign policy than they do on domestic policy, where they have all these congressional barriers that they have to overcome. But the way in which presidents are empowered on foreign policy is unidirectional. They can start wars, they can't end them. They can impose sanctions, they can't lift them. They can, if they push on an open door, meaning they act in accordance with the predisposition and the worldview of the foreign policy establishment, then there's no limit to how far they can go. If they're trying to push against that, even though there's no constitutional power that the establishment and the different foreign policy agencies, intelligence, defense, have to resist presidential policymaking, that resistance happens.
Yeah, I have thought about this a good deal because I think about even when you have people like Mattis who have somewhat dovish instincts, and yet, well, to call it dovish instincts is actually wrong. They have somewhat Trajan instincts. So we've reached the expandable limits of our empire. Let's stop and just maintain what we have. Someone like that gets celebrated by the left, but then when you read some of their actual opinions and what they're still copacetic with the American foreign policy establishment on, such as having to put pressure on Syria, having a somewhat hawkish turn towards Iran without wanting actual war with them, because Mattis would know that we probably would not be able to fully field that war at the moment. And a kind of denial in some ways that how even if America is still the hegemon for the next 50 years, which it may or may not be, I'm not going to, relative decline for everyone seems to be kind of in everybody's cards right now. But that we live in such a multipolar world that you're right. These 1992 to 96 delusions, they were over.
Syndrome.
Yeah, they were over so fast, and yet they seem to define the way a lot of the American policy establishment thinks. And also, I can say this because I taught their kids in other countries and multiple curriculums and teaches their children. So that's very real. What I do sometimes wonder though is like, are the people funding this as ideologically blinkered as the people in it? And I don't know.
Excellent, excellent point. The so the lifeblood of the think tank world is the foundation money, or donor money. And what the reason that I struggled to find a place in the think tank community was question number one, at any meet and greet, was what donor can you bring in? Where's your funding coming from? If you don't have a funding stream attached to yourself, then who are you? Right? Especially if, like me, you're a Canadian, you don't have a H-1B yet. There's very little interest in just picking up another expert, especially one that might disagree with official line. Doesn't matter how good they are. And that funding comes from a number of different sources. You can win government contracts. That's one source, and that encourages the compliance with the hegemonic worldview. You're part of the blob. The blob's giving money to you, so you gotta do the blob thing. Or you can get money from foundations. Generally speaking, they are on the left. It's just, read the New York Times, right? Like, they care about human rights. They want Muslim girls to read, but they don't want Palestinian girls to breathe. And you have this amalgam of kind of like liberal wish lists that will help open up the money bags. One reason why the United States has a de facto promotion of LGBT rights policy abroad, more so, in fact, than domestically, is because that's a great way of getting donor money into the think tanks. Then that gets translated into foreign policy through the policy writing function of the think tanks. There's no big vision there. It's basically just either I want to do good things. I'm a philanthrope, so water, vaccinations, environment, literacy, women's rights, gay rights. There's also a highly transactional component where a industry group might fund a think tank to lobby on behalf of something like IP protections for vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
That'll definitely happen. It's very narrow, very concretely defined transactional interest.
And a think tank is cheap for them too.
And a think tank is cheap compared to lobbying. It's also necessary. Even if you're going down the lobbying route, you need to have a position paper. You need to have a white paper that you can slide across the table with a couple of PhDs that signed off on it and say that, because that becomes the basis of legislation.
Yeah, they're just going to copy and paste the guts of that.
Exactly. Nobody actually, very few political elected politicians do any legislating because they need to spend their time looking after their donors. So they outsource it. You basically buy the position paper you want, and you also have the credibility of the institution that you commissioned it from, and you can use that to push your agenda in Washington. And then there are actual donors that do have some larger geopolitical ambitions. Sheldon Adelson was a great one. They can be very limited, like Israel gets to do whatever it wants. Let's colonize the West Bank. They can also be weirdly eschatological. There's conservative funders that are interested in getting us to the Christian end times, and they'll pay to try to push a foreign policy agenda that reflects that ambition. There are others that are highly Russophobic, or that are frankly fascists and would like to see things like the rehabilitation of Viktor Orban, or a foreign policy that's more conducive to ethno-nationalism. And the government is one mechanism of trying to push through that type of change. But one other thing that becomes clear when you look at security and policy issues, the private sector, independent of Washington, D.C., also plays a significant role. It's like a second center. The big tech companies are probably the most important ones, but in terms of public health, the American big pharma has done a tremendous amount to shape the international IP laws, both to expropriate traditional medicines and biochemicals with potential, biopharmaceuticals with potential therapeutic effect from third world countries, and impose strict pricing and legal regimes to prevent those countries from being able to produce medicine cheaply for their own populations, as well as the shenanigans of taking drugs where the patent is about to expire, changing a single molecule, and securing an extended period of patent protection while refusing to license the old drug. It's and what you see in terms of a global system is not a carefully orchestrated or coordinated vision for how the world should operate, but the sum of all of these different actors working independently within these bureaucratic and political structures that you have in the United States. The one thing that's remarkable about the U.S. compared to Russia and compared to China is that the foreign policy isn't a monopoly of the central government. The China and Russia both impose a great deal more discipline on private actors when they're working in ways that intersect with geostrategic goals. And one reason why it doesn't happen in the United States is because of the internal political economy of the U.S., where the bourgeoisie, or peak, I prefer to think of it as like peak industrial interests, financial elites.
The hot bourgeoisie, like we're not even, not exactly. The general bourgeoisie. Yeah.
Yes, we could say the haute bourgeoisie, although that's black boxing it a little because the sectoral differences matter.
Right. Yeah, I mean, tech is not old, so.
They have a great deal more influence and autonomy in the U.S. than they do elsewhere. The state is reluctant to regulate them or rein them in. China occasionally shoots billionaires, which is probably a good thing. And in France, it's a commonplace for ex-presidents that accepted too much corporate money to sit in court, have to testify, get convicted, right? Often they end up being old enough to sort of get a medical dispensation, but
it's a slap on the wrist, but it's still a slap on the wrist, right?
It is accountability, right? You don't just get away with it.
Yeah, think about in Korea, you have business leaders who occasionally, towards the end of their life, commit ritual suicide for the same reasons.
And that's better, right? It is just straight up better. But in the US, the impunity is total, and the autonomy is great. It's so great that you can run a rogue foreign policy if you're rich enough. Um, and I and I think that also is enabled by this notion that globalization and the spread of markets is inherently beneficial for the United States. So, you should let these entrepreneurs go out and do their thing, because in the end, the market wants America to be king, right? And if it doesn't, well, the market gets what the market wants.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, and in that way, like that is a way in which the American global order is more explicitly in favor of global capital, um, um, than even China or Russia. I was thinking about, I was
Even
watching,
Europe.
yeah, even Europe. Yeah, you're right. I was watching a comparison of like military commercials, and there was a Chinese advocate who was like, "Oh, this says a lot of difference about their ideology." And I thought about it for a while, and I was like, "Well, what it says to me is America in the '40s had very similar videos to what you're seeing in China now." Um, no one in America would believe for a second that we were actually being noble and demanding collective self-sacrifice for the benefit of each other. And so the military knows that that just won't wash. Whereas in China, where, yes, sure, there might be oligarchs that are being propped up by some of this, um, the history of it's not, at this point, a century old. And there is still some check on those oligarchs. And like you said, the same is true in Russia. I mean, domestically, Russian oligarchs can get away with things that probably the U.S. bourgeoisie can't, but they can't do it. Yeah, but they can't do it abroad. So it's it's an interesting difference. Um, I do think that ties to think tank, and the privatization of this is quite interesting. I mean, it started off as largely a right wing kind of dual power para university phenomenon. And when I frame it that way, people are always surprised that I would, but no, they wanted to be able to replace liberal consensus academies doing the same work for politicians in the middle of the 20th century. But effectively now that's across the board. You find, I mean, there's no commie think tanks in the U.S. that I know of that have any real influence. But
I should think not.
Right. But even like the Center for American Progress or the Brookings Institute, are these things? They're much more, they're much more ideologically curtailed, and
there's they used to be centrist, right?
right.
In the era of American, not the Center of American Progress, they knew, but Brookings used to be the kind of middle position during the heyday of post-war liberalism. But then the country shifted right under Reagan, and Brookings basically stayed put, which made it de facto leftist, or de facto on the Washington left.
Liberal spectrum, yeah.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. Like that, there was this. I think of the '60s, the resolution of the '60s as being the culture war got settled by a partition of elite roles by sector. The hippies got the universities and Hollywood and publishing and a bunch of other culture industries. And the conservatives got, the people who thought we should nuke Vietnam, people who didn't understand what was wrong with the My Lai massacre, the people who thought that things were so much better before Black Americans started getting all uppity about their civil rights. They got finance, they got some of politics, and they got the entire business elite. And when that happens, you need to create a conservative alternative to the think tanks, to the universities as centers for policy articulation. And the great thing about think tanks is because they're dependent on donors, they're, and no one has tenure at a think tank. They are essentially scholars for hire, right? Like they have, they're subject to economic and professional discipline by their paymasters. So you can direct them much more forcefully about the conclusions that they should be reaching compared to academics. You never know what you're going to get because they read too much Derrida and Marx.
Right.
But that model, it's not as though now the universities are an alternative to the think tanks. Nobody goes to university. Yeah, if you're like powerful universities will have research institutes that are essentially in-house think tanks that could be commissioned, right? Could get a contract to do either government work or support a particular policy relevant research project. But regular faculty don't do any policy work.
No.
It would be funny to imagine that like Ben Burgess would be writing, we need trans bathroom policy in Georgia. Quick, get me Burgess. No, that doesn't happen. It always goes through some think tank or institute. The universities have the faculties have been neutered. All that the universities can do is try to shape discourse in a kind of Gramscian way, but they don't shape legislation. They don't shape policy. That role has been overtaken by think tanks and institutes, which go on.
No, they don't even really shape their research inputs anymore. I mean, like the amount of private grant money, even in universities, it has to direct where the sources of data come from. I mean, the hard data. I'm not talking about like our humanities or even our sciences overlay of it. Is kind of astounding. One thing I left academia for reasons actually probably similar to you leaving the security apparatus, because I realized how much of that was going on and how much we even if I was I've never been a policy scholar. I'm an English major for the most part, but I was looking at the amount of just data that we got from the think tank. So as a scholar, I would be relying on private polling orgs and think tanks to get my hard data to then kind of crunch around and then have that turn back out to the think tanks to make policy out of it. Like that's what I saw happening in the departments near mine. So
yeah, it's one of the great tragedies of the late 20th century is the decline of American universities, like as in terms of regular faculty, regular students, their teaching mission, their research mission. And it's a story, and it's just the same neoliberal corrosive influence that you see in government, you see in state capacity as well. Basically, in every institution that is not profit fed or profit producing. And as a result, it's great for the privatization of gains, but there are all kinds of goods that are no longer produced or whose production has been gravely compromised by commercial interests because of the refusal to adequately invest in that essential intellectual infrastructure.
Yeah, I think
it's also produced so many podcasters, incidentally.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's face it, I should be working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you should be at a university somewhere. These places need people, right? And they need people like us. It would be a net social benefit.
But
But
I make better living buskering on the internet than I do being an adjunct. Um,
and
since we have an overabundance of useless research faculty. But
these positions should be, like raise the minimum wage and also bump everybody up, right? That would be a solution, and it would be one which would be beneficial, one which would be socially beneficial as well as individually beneficial for the people with increased income. But the the system that we have is optimized not for um, aggregate outcomes, but for the level of influence of individuals monopolizing resources, right?
yeah.
Like the positional advantage of being able to disperse research funds gets lost if research funds are available on a more general basis, right?
Mm-hmm.
When there are more university jobs and they come with research money. But now, um, the by creating essentially these choke points, right? Like in order to access resources, you have to go through the donor circuit that hyper empowers the donors, which the donors love. And if you disagree, you're not going to get that donor money. To some extent, and you said that you mentioned the busker economy, right? Like the crowdsourcing model might represent an alternative, and you kind of see some of the a that like neoliberal control system where peak profit making private institutions, be they corporations or foundations or what have you, get to disperse largesse and therefore control everything downstream. That may be eroding because there are these decentralized forms of aggregating resources upwards, right? Like getting a nickel from enough viewers, and all of a sudden you're actually doing research. All of a sudden you have some outreach. You have so it's possible that and this coincides with the one thing that, to bring it back to the security apparatus, like I've seen it's subject security policy especially is very trend driven. So I mean it feels weird referring to these as trends, but like first there's counterterrorism, then there's like surveillance, there's different solutions, different ways that security is envisaged at different points, and everybody needs to start talking to those talking points. If no matter how good your old program was, unless you can articulate it in the new language, the language of the trend, you're not gonna get funded. And right now, because of a recognition that the discursive monopoly of Western media has been broken, and all of a sudden you've got like the alt-right, but you also have hard socialists, you've got tankies, you've got Black Lives Matter, you've got anti-Black Lives Matter, you've got the weird Trump QAnon people, and is Russia involved? Is China involved? What's going on? There's been a great deal of attention placed on finding mechanisms to steer in this fragmented, kind of disordered environment, steer narrative back into the channels that were conducive for American primacy. And the United States enjoyed a huge unearned and unexamined premium because it was so hegemonic that it was invisible. In the 90s and early 2000s, when there was just this global elite consensus that American leadership was here, it was strong, and it was ultimately good, even if they screw up every once in a while. Even the critics of the United States from 92 to, let's say, 2012 or so, would generally have a tone of, I'm giving you good advice. Look, buddy, come on, man, like, you're better than this. They've only gotten angry recently, or it's only become effective to express anger at the US straight up. You guys are ruining the planet. That used to be a loser as a narrative device, but is no longer the case. And there's an awareness on the part of the elites that pay attention to discourse, which happens to be like the electioneering set that people actually listen to and care about, that the United States needs to regain control of the informational warfighting domain, right? And it may be that the structure of how content is created, shared, funded, makes it a lost cause, right? You're going to have very hard censorship or very, very smart algorithms in order to try to get back to Fukuyama land.
Yeah, it seems like not just the smart algorithms, but smart algorithms that do not hide that they're openly working not just for the government, but for one section of it and one ideological bent of it. And unfortunately, this leads to a lot of conspiracy mongering amongst the right. But there is a sense in which, like, let's just take Facebook. Facebook has openly admitted into engaging into both a mood manipulation and political motivational action, and both sides of the ticket have taken advantage of it. But it does seem that it does favor like a center liberal consensus in how it operates. So it'll be glad to, Facebook, Twitter will be glad to take a lot of eyes and money from all the Trump hysteria for a long time, letting them run roughshod over their policies even before they were fully fledged political figures. But then crack down on them, and then also crack down on a bunch of even non-American small socialist groups and left groups, and there's not much you can do about it. And furthermore, unlike in the normal legal realm or even the realm of like the FCC in regards to traditional broadcasting, enforcement is effectively arbitrary. Everyone has actually violated the terms and conditions of most of these social media groups because they're vague.
And I mean, the terms and conditions are themselves a violation, right? Like,
yeah.
And I remember speaking about this with Gene and Dan Bessner on Burgess's podcast. There right now, if you're in the United States, essentially these platforms decide who gets to say what, who gets to express what the bounds of the expressible are. So, no Nazis, but femboy Nazis maybe, right? No you can be pro-Palestinian, but not too pro-Palestinian. You can be Trump, but not too Trump. And there is some bureaucratic agency inside these conglomerates that makes that decision and enforces it through their private monopoly power. In China, the Chinese government decides on the bounds of the expressible. If you transgress, your content will be purged, and you will be called in to the police station to explain yourself.
Yeah, if you're a scholar, you'll lose your China visa, and you won't be able to get a job even in other countries. Like, I've actually seen this happen multiple times.
Yes.
And
So
that's for good or ill. It doesn't. Yeah, I mean,
the end goal, and this is something that I want to bring up. Wanted to bring up.
mhm.
We're living in a period where there's a real paucity of vision for what an international order means, what it could be, how it could work. Um, to a certain extent, I think that the West has even abandoned, forget the international order, even imagining the future.
Mhm.
Um, the disinvestment in infrastructure, the kind of Elon Musk Mars escape fantasy, the denialism attached to global warming, climate change, large structural problems, which are real and visible.
Mhm.
The United States is not building the future. The United States isn't even maintaining what it has inherited from the past. China is building the future to a certain extent, even places that you wouldn't expect, like the Gulf states, have a future vision.
Yeah, you can easily see it if you're in Dubai. I
Yeah.
mean, like,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Neom, the Saudi future
mm,
city, maybe it's going. It seems grandiose, and maybe it's doomed to fail, but at least it's a vision. Um, Similarly, there are all of these. The United States talks about a rules-based international order, liberal international order, um, and it benefited tremendously from that in the 80s and 90s through the mid 2000s. It also blew it up, and there's no attempt to try to rebuild that order or build a new order in its stead.
mhm.
Um, but what it would take, and what I think there's a space for the left to try to articulate a vision for the future, right?
Mm.
And B, a vision for an international order, because we don't have one right now, neither the order nor the vision. Um, and part of that should be the internationalization of the internet, so that you don't have governments or hyper empowered corporations being able to dictate content. The there's some international agencies that are very effective at regulating things that are incredibly boring and we don't want to think about, like air travel.
Mhm.
Um, and similarly, the internet should be treated like this sort of international commons, where there is a referee. I nominate Iceland, give them a whole bunch of money, and let them make the call. Right? They all speak English. Right? They'd be great at it. Um, they'd have to leave NATO, but I'm fine with that. And that way, we could move to a system where there is a global rule-based order. But right now, um, even when there's a putative rule, like you don't genocide, right? The United States makes whatever carve-outs for itself or its clients that it wants, criticizes China, and China immediately says you're hypocrites because look at A, B, and Z, A, B, A, B,
Yeah,
C,
so
and
now
D.
we can do what we want because you did what you want, and
Exactly.
and they have a point on the two quote K scale. Um,
Yes. And there's no ref, right?
mm,
Not even somebody with forget sanctions power, like to impose penalties, but not even someone who can act as a judge and merely reach a conclusion.
right.
The United Nations was supposed to have served that point, but you're laughing already.
I mean, yeah, when you can sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights but not sign the enforcement court, and it's totally okay for you people who don't know, the U.S. is not a signatory to the Hague enforcement of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights, which it helped draft. Uh,
Yeah. Similarly, the International Court of Justice,
right,
right? Which was an attempt to create just this type of body that I'm talking about,
right.
right? An agency which would have international legitimacy and reach to um, substantiate, right, the rules-based order that was supposed to be the center of the Western contribution to global society, the United States, it's like, wait, we're going to be held accountable? Like, how dare you? How dare you, sir? Good day.
And
How's
what
that?
you find is when you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's no state on earth, including all the signatories, that actually recognizes all of them. And I mean, you have nations that are closer, sometimes Canada, sometimes, except on certain things. But it's almost absurd, because I used to work in international schools that asked me to teach this, and the kids would ask me like, well, who actually follows these these declarations that we all agreed to? And I'm like, nobody, kids, sorry.
Well,
Like,
so it's funny you bring that up, because one of the projects that I recently completed was gender diagnostic note for the World Bank in Malaysia.
okay.
And there is through the World Bank, and I'm not saying that this is a sort of blanket endorsement of the institution, but the awareness that there is an international body that's paying attention, that's issuing reports, that's following up on whether or not you are living up to the pledges you've made, the pledges that previous governments have made, that's running the numbers. It's like, is female literacy increasing or dropping? What about infant mortality, right? What does gender disparities look like in terms of availability of jobs, in terms of income? That creates a mechanism where those pledges are actually backed up. Not perfectly. I'm not saying that the system works, period, nothing to see here, move on. But this largely has to do with the fact that Malaysia is a small population, middle income country that is heavily dependent on international trade and investment. So there is pressure that can be placed on Malaysia. At the same time, when Malaysian political figures, when prime ministers and presidents and chief ministers can announce they've hit their targets, that's a huge boost in their prestige, right? The idea of progress still exists, and these agencies, these international benchmarks, are seen as like tangible measures of that. Even in Europe, for instance, there's a lot more benchmarking. Like, do we have enough women in parliament? Are we at 70% of Norway, which is acceptable, or are we at 60% of Norway, which is bad? Right? An awareness that there is some civilizational standard, if you forgive the expression, that it is appropriate to reach. And granted, the sort of fascist right wants to burn that down, as well as the EU, right?
And they might get a chance in the next couple elections too.
Frankly. They might. I also in the Anglo transatlantic world, the tendency towards U.S. unilateralism is a similar impulse to burn down all of these international observers, get rid of them. None of this matters. None of these rules matters. No one can hold us accountable. When we act, we create our own reality. And that is a very damaging development, right? There isn't universal cynicism around things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. There's an awareness of the fact that none of it has been attained, but there are parts of the world where they're not ready to bin it. Like even countries like Vietnam, which is a communist dictatorship, still sees value in the legacy of the 20th century notion of material and social progress. But in the peak countries, or especially the United States, right? There's like malaise and demoralization that is set in, and part of it is, this is the problem with winning, right? If you win so completely that the Soviet Union abolishes itself and they ask you to please come and open a McDonald's, then you don't have a sense of um, what more needs to be done, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
easy to get lost in your own delusions. And when the US simultaneously achieved its greatest geopolitical success, while at the same time continued to hollow out its own society, you get to a point where what's the value of winning? What's the value of anything if all this generations of historical success have brought us to this point where people die because they can't afford insulin?
You know, and normally I would go all Marxist here, but I'm actually going to go all Ibn Khaldun here. That does seem to be the general history of successful empires. Is their success does weaken their internal infrastructure and their vision to the point that they let things internally fall apart first. Usually, I mean, you know, for whatever you can say about, you know, the Roman Empire, we can speculate on the death by 1,000 cuts it suffered over about 200 years. It very much seems that a large part of it was internal malaise, bad policy, and the breakdown of their own internal infrastructure, which led to people basically hiding out on manors, and that those manors becoming a separate form of government over time. And we don't live in that world now, but there does seem to be a way in which, like, there's both imperial, you know, there's normal capitalist decadence. You're an economist. I don't know what you think about profit rate declines and all that, but there's also imperial governmental decadence that is both tied to and separate from that. I mean, and I do think success is a large part of why that happened in the United States, combined with economic, you know, fallback. But yeah,
I think that there's a lot to what you're saying. That I'd also bring up this one mechanism that I came across in a paper by Baumol like years ago, where he was looking at the incentive structures of various great imperial civilizations and the direction in which elites were incentivized to go.
mm-hmm.
In China, the elite trajectory was officialdom and corruption.
Mm-hmm.
You do really well on your Confucian exams. That allows you to work for the emperor, and then you can sort of steal money, or if you're above regular corruption, you're just you're capturing rents.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a tremendous amount of energy and enterprise by the most well positioned members of society that just go into an academic beauty contest in order to capture rents.
Mm-hmm.
Not productive. In the Roman Empire, there's also like a decadence version of this, right? Where at the beginning, it is a meritocracy of administration. You are creating canals, you're building roads, right? You're growing, but in the end, it turns into rent seeking. In the Roman Empire, the elite goes into the military, and you begin with external conquest, but it ends up that you go into the military there's nowhere worth anything left to conquer, and you fight each other.
Mm-hmm.
Again, destructive. And in the US, and I see this in the tech sector, and I see this in, from my experience in American elite universities. You have students with tremendous intellectual potential, right? Like, not everybody has the same intellectual endowments. Some people can solve extraordinarily complicated equations or put together extraordinarily complicated technical schemes. You know, you can design all kinds of different things if you're smart enough. Not everybody's that smart. Now, rather than taking that human potential and putting it into things like vaccines or productive applications of AI, we end up with 12 different versions of Tinder, right? We end up with Viagra for your dog. The incentives, the incentivization scheme for human enterprise is so slanted towards commercialization and profit capture that you squander your most productive potential in these basically short-term financializable enterprises like startups, you name it. And it's gotten to a point where they're not even market conducive. In the financial sector, it's just about finding a new rent to capture or a new form of positional capital without actually producing any efficiencies or, God forbid, any breakthroughs, any new products. And I think we've been on this treadmill for a while now. And how do we get off?
I've been pushing back on people who think we've been investing a lot into, you know, new technologies, when I'm like, this right here is the last major life-changing technology that I know. And yes, it altered a lot of things, but it's all in terms of communication capacity. And most of what has spawned in the last 10 years, which, you know, is, I don't know, most of its life, is redundant app capture and rent seeking.
Yeah.
And then disruption through taking admittedly sclerotic, you know, very bureaucratized sections of the economy and disrupting them, but making them even less efficient.
More exploitative.
Yeah, and highly and more highly exploitive. You're completely correct. So, you know, and convincing people that that exploitation is for their own good. That, you know, it's weird because, yeah, I don't know if people know Tyler Cohen, and he's not a leftist, much less a Marxist, but he and I have been making a lot of the same points on this for a long time. And it's like, you know, I went to Korea and lived there for 3 years, and socially it felt like it was going through its 1950s into the 1960s, but technologically I was embarrassed. Like, like it was just, everything worked better and was easier to access and was more publicly available, even to the poor. And even in places like where you barely had like plumbing, you had efficient public transit and good communication networks and you know, better use of public land even.
If you want to see the future, just go to Estonia, right? Like,
yeah,
the fact that other countries have unlocked
and kind of marginal, small, like peripheral countries in a lot of ways. I mean, I know like Estonia and Korea are not poor. They're, you know, they're in the economically developed nations, but like those would not be like historically the areas you go to find the hubs of innovation. These are small states on the, you know, on the edges of different empires. Yeah, what's your theory?
Well, there's a couple of different things at work. One is, and this is true of a lot of the East Asian miracle economies, there's a security pressure that forces um, a government to be much more responsive and capable across the board. Because if you fall too far behind, if you make too many mistakes, if you're too corrupt, then North Korea could swoop in or Russia could swoop in. And even at a significant remove from the period when the security threat was most intense, there are positive legacies that come from that. The the Japanese bureaucracy is strong, a little sclerotic, but strong, right? Like they've got the fantastic trains, they've got the good internet. So it can scale up, but I think that one major component that is difficult to replicate is the extent to which, especially the government elite, is connected to the rest of the population. So you don't need to even have elections for it. A small enough country where the regular people, just by dint of the fact that you can't lose yourself in the anonymity of 300 million Americans, and there is a sense of solidarity driven by a notion of like shared community and shared destiny, helps increase the capacity of state apparatus and delivery of services, because you delivering services to yourself in a way, right? You're going to be using this internet, you're going to be using this public transit. If not you, your family. If not your family, someone like your family. While in countries that get too big, the state elite loses any sense of connection with the larger population. In Russia, I'm told that the oligarchs and their set, as well as important political figures, refer to the public at large as bidlo, which means cattle or livestock. They're not even human. And in the U.S., the isolation of especially the peak policymaking elites is total, right? Like they do not talk to regular people. They have to guess what a regular life is like, and typically badly.
They have think tanks to reconstruct it for them poorly.
Yes, and worse, whenever they think of a public service, they imagine the person using it belonging to a group that they have nothing but the most profound contempt for. If you're Kamala Harris, you think of poor white racists as the people who will benefit from whatever public service. And if you're Mitch McConnell, you think of like BLM thugs and Antifa goons as being the people who benefit, or illegals, right? The canard on the right that illegals are sapping billions of dollars of services from the United States when they can't even qualify for most of them. Like if you're never going to use the service that you're responsible for, designing, planning, implementing, and operating, no, of course it's going to be crappy.
I think this leads to an interesting challenge on the left, though, when it comes to international order, and it's something that I think I have noticed myself. I noticed that, for example, none of these countries that we mentioned, Estonia, South Korea, Vietnam, are paradises by any stretch of the imagination. However, all of them have lower Gini coefficients. All of them have fairly efficient internal services. Yes, they usually eventually get neoliberalized, see the Nordic countries, but that neoliberalization is slower and less thorough.
And more easily reversible.
Right. Whereas, however, we also know that we need an international order that is fairly strong for anything like a socialist project to be viable. And this kind of both thinking larger and smaller simultaneously, while it gets sometimes like, I remember activists, from the 60s forward going, think global, act local. But I mean, like, it's almost like build local, build global at the same time. And that is a challenge for most left-wing thinkers. And as you and I have hinted at, not only are they most left-wing thinkers totally removed from power and doesn't know how any of these people are working and just can project upon them, they're also way more parochial thinkers than they realize, because they have not seen not just the world, I mean, but even elements of their own society that are fairly cordoned off from them.
So one obvious question is, when you say a socialist experiment or a socialist project, what we need to think about, like, what are the parameters for that? Like, if I could make every country South Korea, as ruthless as South Korean capitalism is, I would, because it would still be better.
It would be better than the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I will die on the hill that the Nordic countries are not socialism. However, I would probably still rather live there.
Yes, I mean, so there's that, which is essentially a reformist capitalist project, which is still a worthwhile one because the human welfare gains are massive. Then there's the question of, like, to what extent can you detach from larger economic patterns, or insulate yourself from total marketization to create local economies that need not be financialized, marketized, profit driven. Now, like, one could imagine a situation in which fully automated Amazon factories and fully automated Amazon distribution centers handle certain kinds of commodity production as basically global labor saving, but local economies produce food. Everything is farm to table, and the farmer owns his own land, right? Every bit of furniture is made locally by craftsmen, right? Like that, operate in syndicates, or with labor unions, or in some other empowering structure which doesn't have top-down control, where properties distributed equitably. So every family owns their own land, right? Their own dwelling place. And you could have a much more distributed kind of like sharing economy. I don't like that word, but within the locality, you don't apportion resources based on a profit maximization scheme, but from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Like, maybe that's possible under certain conditions, and maybe we should think about, like, how do you get to the conditions where that sort of localism is viable? Maybe it's a UBI, maybe it's land reform. If you think about Midwestern cities where there's vacant properties that they're tearing down, maybe urban homesteading, give away the vacant to anybody that's willing to live there, that this has below a certain household wealth. Some kind of roll back food subsidies for agribusiness, replace it with food subsidies for small producers, as long as they hit certain nutritional, organic, environmental standards and they deliver locally. That if you do that, then maybe you can, on a local level, build that type of socialist economic exchange. And then on the global level, you need something to reel in the leviathans, right? Like, because Amazon isn't going to give up anything without a fight, right? Um, the I don't know how you do either. If you'd like to, if you'd like to sign a contract with my one-man consultancy, then I'll happily do the study. Right? I'll put together a proposal, PowerPoint deck. You'll have everything you need. There can even be a website, but that costs extra. I think that this is a problem. Like, this is potentially a fruitful path to go down. Like, this is something that one could study. This is something that one could develop a paradigm around. Nobody's doing it.
Right.
Nobody's doing it, and why would you?
There's no profit maximization in it. There's no key way to power, and talking about globalizing certain parts of the economy while hyper localizing others and destroying entire infrastructures of middlemen. Not that if you had a strong enough UBI and social supports that the destruction would destroy them, but in the interim, it's pretty daunting.
Yeah, and ironically, like, the Swedish government might pay for this study,
Yeah.
but the American government won't. Right? Like, the places which need it least are the ones most likely to get it.
Right.
And frankly, I think that we're going to see an amplification of divergence over the next 20 years. Part of it is the differential impact of climate change, and the fact that if you have a responsive state structure and a relatively cohesive national community, you're going to weather it better. And as a result, you'll do better, while a country like the United States is going to get hit harder and do worse. So I think that part of me thinks that the end of the world is coming, and part of me thinks that the end of the world is coming for most people, right? Like, but like, Japan will probably be fine, right? Like, Iceland will be fine, Norway will be fine. Their biggest concern is going to be all of the people fleeing from places that aren't fine.
Right. And they're small nations, and if they shut their doors too much, they'll be overwhelmed.
Yeah, or they're going to have to go full genocidaires, right?
Right. I mean, so yeah, I don't want. I've said this twice today. I think in the short term, the prognostics are really, really bad. I think for the average person in America, the end of empire is going to be really shitty, but then things may actually get better for them if they survive the process. And that's a very strange thing to put up. But I even think about Britain. Like, Britain kind of became a less shitty society after it went through the lean years. Then it didn't last very long, admittedly, because it still has imperial nostalgia creep and as the great money launderer of the world. But like, there was a time period where things got better for them because they weren't trying to maintain this incredibly the extraction was almost costing as much to maintain as what you were getting back at a certain point.
Well, one irony of Western imperialism is that often the colonies were just money sinks. There were a few that were gems, rock stars, like the Belgian Congo did wonderful things for King Leopold. India, of course, floated the entire British Empire. Singapore, Hong Kong, these were great. Many of the African colonies, just money holes, no upside. But they couldn't help themselves, right? It becomes the compulsion the profit motivation, which is rational, right, within a capitalist economic system, gives way to the mastery compulsion, which is irrational, and that which gets exacerbated by inter-imperial competition. So when Rome had no imperial competitor, it could leave blank spots on the map, right? It's just like not worth going any further. But when you have two empires, everything needs to belong to one or the other, because if it doesn't, if it belongs to no one, you're worried the other guy will get it.
Yeah, no, that competition model is very, very clear, and I wonder what the scramble is going to look like with China, becoming more and more of an international influence. Even if it doesn't seem particularly interested in direct military imperialism, its economic models are only slightly less predatory than the West. They are less predatory, but they're not.
I think the analysis that's worth doing is, to what extent does China, to what extent does a developed economy under these world conditions need to reach out into other regions and other countries? So the Chinese economy, for instance, at this point, there's some demand for cheaper labor than what's available locally, largely because they've run out, right? Like, people have moved from the village to the cities. The demographic change is underway, but they're also automating very quickly.
They've relaxed their internal passport system in the last 5 years too. So
so to a certain extent, maybe they want cheap labor, but they're also at a technological stage where they can automate pretty effectively a lot of different processes. There are some strategic minerals, cobalt, yttrium, niobium, like rare earths, that they may not be able to produce in enough quantities locally. They produce a fair amount of them locally, but they may need more. So that's something you need to go abroad to get. Oil. Do they need oil? I don't know. I don't think so, actually. They're engineering a transition towards hydrogen. They're world leaders in renewables. I actually don't think that they're going to be scrambling for hydrocarbons. So, like, I think that the reason that we're seeing them push into Africa, and there's a different logic to what they're doing on the Eurasian mainland and what's happening in Africa. But the whole Belt and Road Initiative and their engagement in abroad is presented as this, depending on, ironically, it's something where conservative NatSec hawks and Marxists agree that China's doing this for as an imperial step, right? But there's a domestic political economy case to be made that, as the Chinese economy matured and as more and more infrastructure projects were completed in China, the marginal utility of continuing to build cities in the desert, that diminished quite rapidly. So you have all of this surplus engineering and production capacity, and not just the construction work, but also all of the inputs, the cement, the steel, the concrete. You can't do anything with it locally. If you do, then you may end up producing something worth less than the cost of the inputs. But you also don't want to wind down those sectors, because it will be it will be a terrible shock to the economy. So what do? You do the same thing that Japan did when it built too many cars. You dump it in the international market. But you can't do it. There's not a market mechanism to do it. You can't sell bridges, right? Like at a dealership. So instead, you create a international initiative to do infrastructure work internationally, financed by China, which will then recoup the state will recoup the money. Paid for, the contractors get paid by China. The companies get their profits. The workers keep their jobs. Most of these projects, whether dams, roads, highways, trains, are constructed by using Chinese labor. That's one complaint that's made against them, that they bring their own labor. They refuse to train us. It's like, that's their upside. They don't have to fire these people. They don't want to hire your ass. They want these people to keep their jobs. Won't you think of the poor Chinese comrade worker? And the so it's not that they're reaching into Africa for minerals or reaching for hydrocarbons. Is that they're dealing with, and this is we can go back to Marx, right? This is the crisis of overproduction.
Right, it's a crisis of overproduction. It's a good way to. I actually don't think they have a purely extractive notion with Africa. It's just Africa may benefit from the infrastructure, but it doesn't benefit from the skilling, because China uses a lot of its own labor. That becomes a problem because it makes Africa still dependent on Chinese expertise, and there are leaders in Africa who are very well aware, and I've even talked to them, that this is a problem for them, but they'd also rather deal with China, even if they hold some of their motives suspect, than us.
No.
So because
China's obviously better,
right, yeah,
because you get
Africa,
the road.
Yeah, you get the road, and China is also much more into soft power right now than military power, because even kind of right wing on the Chinese scale, and I know when I say that, people were like, what are you talking about? There is a Chinese right, that they don't see themselves as ready to be a military hegemon, and they're not quite sure it's worth the trouble.
Well, also Chinese soft power is basically amounts to bullying Muslim countries not to complain about Xinjiang.
Yeah.
While Western soft power might be telling conservative religious society, you're going to need to re-engineer everything for the ground up because we don't think you're nice enough to trans girls. So it's a very different price tag. It's also a very different attitude, right? There's a Western tendency to want to impose their vision for just and functioning society everywhere, with Western universalism eroding any concessions for cultural difference. And it's not just Viktor Orban complaining about it. Right? You have plenty of people in the global South that also see that as a very suspect move on the part of white feminists, you name it, right? And China it's purely transactional. Right? It's very simple, right? Like, here are the 50 search terms you have to purge from your internet, and then we good. Don't ever mention Tiananmen.
Well, we'll end off on that. I was going to ask you about how we deal with de-imperialization, but without just letting things fall into chaos. But we are close to 2 hours on, and that question is at least probably a half an hour. So
next time,
Kuba will probably be back given our instructions. You can find him doing commentary occasionally on Thursday nights, sporadically at This Is Revolution, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm part of the Foreign Policy Thursdays extended TIR universe.
Yeah. I will be on there myself on the 3rd of June to talk about drug policy and its effect on Central America, because it's something I've lived through. But yeah, so you can find Kuba again. He'll be back here. I'd like to thank him, thank you guys, and I'm gonna let Kuba, go get some rest.
Thank you. Pleasure is mine.
Pleasure is mine too. Thank you. All right, and now. All right, guys. I ended the main part of the show. I am going to honor the Q&A section, just not with Kuba because we went a little long. I also have to do right now for my Patreons who are $10 subscribers, because we're in a busker economy and I honor my part of the deal, read off my officers for the week, and then I'm going to leave questions up to you. Sorry to play the music, so a lot of you had it out, but I wanted to clearly end that part of the show. So our $10 patrons are Ress, Eric Rapp, Shannon Kerr, Brian Shaughnessy, Kilgore Kraut, Rock for Light, Choice Fantastic, Ben Hanshoe, Electric Apprentice, Michael, and Night of Sorrow, and anyone who subscribed since then. We'll get it on the next episode. We had some debate about China and Chinese culture, and I want to say, talking about China as a monolithic 600-year society, when you're not specifically talking about the Han, but different governments that have ruled that region, is like saying that every group that has ever lived in Italy is Rome. There are massive cultural and even linguistic distinctions between the people who dominated government in different periods of China's history. And outside of English, that name isn't even consistent. I will agree with people like Carl Jha that there is a contiguous Han culture of some variety going back 6,000 years. It has not been contiguous with the government. And with that is my last bit of educational knowledge for you. Do you have any questions real fast before I cut us off? No? Good. Thank you, guys. I enjoyed your commentary tonight. We were reading it, but I thought we needed to let Kuba talk because some of what we were talking about is important and a little bit complicated. There's a $3 patron tier. These streams are still free for a reason. And they're gonna like the Monday and Wednesday streams will always be free. The audio for them, if you want it early and complete with everything, you do have to pay $3. And then we have a $3 tier, $5 tier, and a $10 tier. And you know what? If you don't have the money, I actually could use you guys subscribing, getting other people to subscribe, writing reviews on the podcast, because we now have a podcast called if you don't have it, I don't need to take it from you. I think Kuba is a very smart guy, and I think you guys need to hear from him. And we obviously would probably have different conceptions of what socialism and the international order is, but it's better to deal with. Person with Mandarin name I can't pronounce. Better not to. It will attract state back trolls. I'm for real. I'm sure you're right. I will say this though. I don't know. I'm sure that was it Patterson as a response? This is a crazy. I'll answer it. How strong was Patterson as a response to the River Wasteland? It's the only William Carlos Williams poem I like, but I'd rather leave the cantos. Kuba is I think would very much see himself as coming out of Probably something adjacent to social democracy, although he does know second and third international doctrine pretty well. He sometimes rereads that back onto Marx, but if your exposure to that is from Central Europe, I think that is pretty valid, which I think would make it part of the reason why he is more sympathetic to social democratic and reformist capital projects, because he also thinks the quality of life gains are important. But he's not particularly sectarian, nor would I even say he's a sectarian of one. Dr. Gene here, Cooper's non-denominational. Yeah. We'd like to thank Dr. Gene Badgelon for tonight, because he's been important in getting me in contact with some of these foreign policy experts. I will also be in contact with some people that I know. I'm reaching out to a bunch of people on Asia stuff who live and work in Asia at a variety of levels. Some are Westerners, some are Korean and Japanese. I'm trying to work on some Vietnamese. That's a little harder. Some Vietnamese experts from the country. There we go. So with that note, since we don't have a lot of questions, I just wanted to give my shout outs and give Kuba an out so he could go eat dinner, or whatever he needed to do. I'm going to play the outro music in full, and head on out. I want to thank you guys. Can I get Carl Ja? I don't know that I want to, but sure. I mean, I contact him. But sure. I would, I am distrustful of internet celebrity, but Carl seems to be very knowledgeable on a lot of subjects, particularly Chinese history, in a way that a lot of people who debate him just really aren't. But there are things about contemporary China that I think he soft pedals, to put it mildly. All right. On that, I'm gonna let you guys go.